What is aggro?
Baby, don't hurt me no more. Baby, don't hurt me no more.
Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things Cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, aka UberBear, and today we're joined by our two amazing hosts. And I don't have to, nobody picks favorites, but today I'm picking a favorite. You know who you are. You know who you are.
It's Stu. Hi, Stu. You're the favorite of today.
That is simply not true. And you know it. So stop trying to,
Well, today in
mislead
particular,
people.
Stu is probably my least favorite because I may have misplayed, we'll just say Manifest Dread multiple times. Maybe cheated, but I outed my own cheat, FYI.
Maybe.
I outed my own cheat.
There's a pattern that has been discussed on previous episodes of this podcast when we get together to play Magic, and it invariably is Anthony either not understanding the rules of a particular Magic card, or there has been occasions where, have I played a land for turn? Yes, Anthony, this would be your third land for the turn. And no, you do not have exploration or fast bond on the battlefield. So It's like, and it's not even that it's not obvious. It's like, dude, it's turn 2. You have 6 lands out. What's going on?
Rampant growth.
But yes, there was an event yesterday. Anthony hosted. We played some Magic. It was fun.
We had a great time. We celebrated our buddy David's birthday party, got together, and we tested our CubeCon cubes. We ran the UberBears Artifact Cube and the FIM through the ringer, but from like hey, call out cards, let me know, because by the time this recording is coming out, we are, if already not past the date, which I imagine that is true.
I'm pretty sure you're past the date.
Pretty sure we're past the date. So in the past, this has happened. But either way, yeah, we just had a great time getting together. And misplays did happen on my part. I went ahead and conceded. I said, you know what? I totally screwed this up.
It's understandable. So yes, as you mentioned, it was Manifest Dread. So this is a new mechanic in the Duskmourn?
I didn't actually manifest the card. I put a card in the yard, and then I just drew the card to my hand. And then once I realized I did that, I had already passed the turn. It just so happened to be a fatal push.
We had an episode talking about the mechanic.
Yeah, not a faithless looting. It was
a fatal push. So when I drew it to my hand, I had something I could go ahead and deal with. So I went ahead and cast it, and then I killed one of Stu's creatures. Board changes up. Things are changing in the structure.
It just wasn't.
And then I realized what I had.
Anthony, this is an intervention.
We
need to talk about reading the card.
And it was a Steel Overseer in my Hardened Scales, +1/+1 counters deck. Like, that's quite the piece that I need.
Pretty good.
And Anthony cheated to remove it. Thank you, Anthony.
But that's not what this episode is about. So
I was just about to have all this fun with my deck until Anthony manifested Dread a fatal push into his
Would you
hand.
say
anyway?
You would say that was a little aggro of me, would you not?
It was a very aggressive of you. Yes, yes, it was.
So before we get into this what is aggro conversation that we're about to have, we're going to enjoy our libations of the show. And May, you've already declared your drink. What are you having?
I am just keeping it simple with some water and staying hydrated.
And how about yourself, Stu?
I am I'm watching what I eat and drink right now. You're
looking at it, yes.
Yes, thank you. So I am currently drinking. It's the Yellowtail Pure Bright, and I'm sort of flipping between the Sauvignon Blanc and the Pinot.
I'm having something that I'm probably going to regret. This was left in our fridge by our good friend Grant last night, and I'm like, ooh, what is this? And it's Stone Enjoy by 10/31/24. That's the name of it, is Enjoy by October the 31st, 2024.
Spooky.
Yep, it's a hazy IPA, so here we are. I'm going to crack this open. Let's get to the topic. All right. Question. I'm going to ask both of you. It's just an open-ended question. What does aggro mean to you? Let's start with you, May. What is aggro?
So, aggro, what it means to me is that you are playing a deck that's trying to play the most mana-efficient creatures that deal the most amount of damage in the shortest amount of time.
I would expand I don't disagree that those are definitely part of a creature-based aggro strategy. I would also argue that you could play an aggro spell-based strategy, like a burn-based aggro as an example, some lightning bolts, some lightning helixes, and the like. But yeah, I think typically you're not concerned with your life total. You're not concerned with anything other than as quickly as possible using every resource to reduce your opponent's life total to 0, or maybe giving them 10 points poison counters if you're on an infect strategy.
I'll have a follow-up question then. In the topic of aggro, how much is 1 mana worth to you?
About $12. Oh, you're talking from a... Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that is a value that is fluctuating, or has maybe not even fluctuated, has been on a bit of a meteoric rise. I think your 1 mana 1/1, 2 mana 2/2, 3 mana 3/3, like those days are well behind us in the days of Modern Cube and Modern Magic. So I would probably argue maybe I want to get 2 points of either damage or potential damage for each mana spent. That's kind of a ballpark. What do you think?
I'm going to go a different direction with this. I'm going to reframe kind of what you said. You did a mana efficiency to damage is what you did. You did input versus output.
Sure.
I'm going to do this more of it's okay from a mana perspective to be shorter, as in you need less. The requirements of the deck typically can be less. Like you can build in a 40 card deck, I can go down to 12, 14, 15 max on my mana basis, knowing that my mana transition, or that input output that you just kind of did where I'm putting X amount, my mana transition to lightning bolt converts to 3 damage for 1 mountain.
It does.
Right? Or a 2-for-1, which we're going to talk about, converts to 2 damage mostly. Right?
Okay.
So now 5 damage for 2 mana. So we're already a quarter of the way done.
Right.
Right. So the conversion rate's a little different. So that's where I'm kind of thinking about that, but we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit because I've got some more questions for you guys.
Okay.
All right. So would you say that it is the fastest deck? By just loosely definition, would you call it the fastest deck in your cube?
Say on average it is, but I think that niche scenarios where combo decks tend to be faster.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that, because it's not always about having dealt the damage, right? That is the goal of the aggro deck, is to win the game quickly and efficiently with well-costed creatures and or burn spells or whatever are going to reduce your opponent's life total down to 0. But that's not always the goal of a deck, right? So a control deck is just looking to gain an overwhelming advantage when it comes to things like, mana and card advantage, stuff like that, right? And similarly, a combo deck is looking to assemble something that is going to be unbeatable. Like if you're talking Vintage Cube, where aggro is relatively lower down on the power band, right? Putting out an Atraxa on turn 1 or 2 with a Reanimate is going to pretty much make it almost impossible for like a burn deck if you've got some lifelink creature out there. So it's difficult to say if I think it should be the fastest deck. I think it's more to... I think it would be more like the most reliable deck, if that's maybe the best way of putting it, because you want to be able to say 1 mana, I've got plenty of options, and I can guarantee on turn 1 I can put a 1 mana creature or play a 1 mana burn spell, and on turn 2 I'm trying to do the same thing turn 3, turn 4, and I'm hoping to get the game over by the time like turn 4 or turn 5 comes around.
So Magic is a turn-based game. It's stop motion, if you will, right? But if you put it into real time and you actually played the game real time, like an RTS, the aggro deck for me still equals the speed, the fastest form of aggression.
Okay.
Would you agree with that statement?
It's aggro and Magic is like the Zerg Rush strategy,
exactly.
obviously.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
You're trying to make as many cheap units as you can to get out as much damage as you can as quickly as possible before anybody else is ready.
Yep, you've got your Zerglings, and then you've got your Queens to, maybe that's your Anthem effects or something of the like, and you're just trying to squeeze damage through wherever possible.
But because it's turn-based, it doesn't have that appearance of speed.
Correct.
Would you agree with that? Like, because it's not an RTS. Everybody agree with that statement, right?
We'll go with that, sure.
Yeah, so your units are going forward. So do you think that's a fair estimation of aggro, is just sending units out basically like a salvo of missiles? They're just going at you zug, and they don't stop.
I mean, that's your goal. Your hope is that you can play mana efficient creatures to make it difficult for your opponent to be able to deal with them, either because their own creatures are maybe on the utility side, or it's all very well and good if you're putting a Snapcaster Mage out, but if I'm putting a 3-mana or 2-mana 3/3 out like a Colonian Hydra that can't block very well, then yes, that's how you're trying to manage your aggro strategy.
Because the game is turn based, and because you're moving through it, and we're doing stop motion, we're doing turns. What is the differentiation in turns? Because we're doing timestamps, if you will, right? How far apart, and you said Colonial Hydra, that's a good example of kind of what I'm going to mention here, are 2 1-for-1s, which we're going to go into a little further here. How far apart on the spread do you want your mid-range to begin to set up? That it starts, you don't want it to stonewall aggro too soon. Not in your mind, you don't want to be stonewalled as the aggro player. So there's a time differentiation there. Turns based. Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
So how far apart in timing in order to effectively have what you're declaring as an aggressive package in your cube, do you want your mid-range to come online so that you can then clearly see that thin red line between the delineation between aggro and then what becomes mid-range?
I don't know if there's a definitive answer for that, and I think maybe that's somewhat cube dependent, but typically I am looking for probably at the earliest turn 2 and maybe typically on turn 3 to 4, where I'm looking at my mid-range creatures doing something like, I'm looking at a Fulminator Mage on turn 3, right? I'm looking at a Bloodbraid Elf on turn 4. Bloodbraid Elf is a 4-mana 2/2, which in an aggro strategy is atrocious, but it could, it could bring me into something that's going to give me a card advantage, right? Classic Jund strategy. So does that kind of
it does
answer the timing question?
There's a timing situation that happens there so that you can then declare something as this is my aggro suite versus this is my mid-range suite. And are you intentional in that spread? Because sometimes these lines get blurred and then we declare them as the fastest deck. Because some cubes, because this is context dependent, right? Sometimes it is the highest, fastest performing deck, the one that gets out there, that is the aggressive or the aggressor in the game. Would you agree with what I'm saying there?
Yeah, and I would argue that the reason for that is because if you are playing an aggro deck, the absolute king or queen or whatever is consistency, right? You must be able to consistently use your mana, put your threats out, and make sure that you're attacking your opponent's life total or banging those poison counters down.
So, May, I've got to follow up on that as we try to define this weird line here. Is it defined by the magnitude of board presence, getting the threats on the board, because the single threats oftentimes don't take you to that, negative 20 against the opponent? Or is it things like keywords haste? Or is it burn support? Things that carry you to that finish line because you're trying to drive them to 0.
So I think I'm understanding what you're trying to ask. Like Stu said, it is very cube dependent. And depending on what your environment you're working with, there can be aggro packages that have just a pile of 2-drops that are still aggressive by that cube standard. But typically there is a sort of cutoff point that's this arbitrary line in the sand that we're going to say as the designer that we try to make across somewhere of saying, this is how fast I want the aggro deck to be winning or be getting close to closing the game, right? So, for example, in the Fey Cube, getting up to turn 5 is a reasonable endpoint for aggro, right? And that's not true for a lot of environments. But pretty much after that is where all the relevant cards start coming into play that just completely shut down your strategy. So that is essentially your cutoff point in the Fey Cube, just as a specific example. Now, I could just go through the list of cards and say that these are the specific examples that I have to fill those specific roles or whatever. But ultimately, it comes down to what is my aggro package trying to pressure? Because it's not just mid-range that you have to worry about. It's your control decks, your combo decks, and your mid-range decks. And you need to look at your aggro package and ask yourself, what decks are is this pressuring? Like, one of my most common things that I say in regards to 5-color good stuff is, If people are getting away with 5-color good stuff, it means that your aggro package is weakened. Because aggro packages innately punish greedier land bases and whatnot, because while people are spending their turn fixing their mana and doing whatnot, you should be getting in damage, so that way by the time that they get to play their spells, it's too late.
Yeah, so you summed up what I was going to say here. We're going to kind of open up a discussion just on 2 1s-for-1s right now. I want to kind of use that as the poster child. And everybody, for our purposes right now, let's just picture a Savannah Lion and a Jackal Pup, right? We'll do one from Boros, which is the typical aggro package. We know that black and green and even sometimes blue can go into this depending on the cube, right? But let's keep it simple. Let's do Savannah Lions, Jackal Pup for whatever our initial conversation is here. So what May said was the purpose of it is to turn 1, put a 2/1 on. Turn 2, put a 2/1 on. And we'll just keep playing 2/1s. We're not even going to add anything else to that. So we're representing 2 damage, then 4 damage, and then 6 damage. We know that has diminishing returns because now that line is now happening where you're mid-range, the Colonial Tuskers you mentioned, or Colonial Hydra.
That's right.
It doesn't matter which whenever you pick. And those start literally just stonewalling it, right? That strategy will peter out. There's no way around it. Unless you have, supplementary things to get you through. We'll kind of get to that. So 2 1s-for-1s will be kind of the focus for the next few minutes. But let's kind of do the pros of aggro, right? Early damage potential. But how much does that matter? That's my question for both of you. Early damage. You struck them for 2, then you struck them for 4, then you struck them for 6. How much does the mid-range and control deck care about that?
A lot.
Yeah, a lot. It can potentially. Because now, if you get to the point where you're playing some kind of combo deck or some kind of control deck, it's sort of like the trifecta, the triumvirate, right? The aggro decks are typically quite effective against control decks because control decks are typically hoping to be able to respond on a 1-to-1 kind of basis. And if you start getting multiple pieces out on the field, or you start putting these unanswerable pieces out just purely because you've been able to use your 1 mana for each of your threats rather than maybe 2 or heaven forbid 3 mana for your interaction from the control player's perspective, now things start to get a little bit more tricky when it's like, okay, I kind of want to be able to keep control of this game, but now I've got, even if it's just 2 power creatures that are smacking me, now it's 4 damage, and then it's 8, and then it's 12 damage. And suddenly the strategy of, I want to develop my game plan and control the board comes down to, can I survive?
Yeah, so this is going back to what I was saying before. The stop motion of this game makes this manageable. But I want you to put yourself back into the RTS. Let's do Command and Conquer, OG, or let's do original Warcraft or StarCraft, right? When this onslaught of these things start coming at you, the idea in my mind is for aggro to unsettle the establishment of mid-range and control. The only thing that gives us that little bit of grace is because we're not real time. We're stopping. The game of Magic is turn-based. So you can stop, pass turn, and now you can think about it. But there is still a degree of, and that's one of the pros I have, it's still unsettling to the mid-range and control player. Like, to keep a cool head when Jackal Pup, Savannah Lions, and so on just keeps coming at you. Lightning strikes, I don't care. They just keep tossing it at you. It's now changing the dynamics, or in this case, to reference a little bit of LPR, it's changing the tactics on the field. Like, you're forcing them to think outside the box, where maybe they had a direct line of play, and they still may. Some players will stay cool and clear, and they'll keep trying to go to that Reanimator push, or they'll continue to force through to their combo Storm deck or whatever, and try to ignore that swath coming at them. There's a point where the storm doesn't stop.
Yeah, and I think a good combo player and a good control player will understand when they sit down to play a game of Magic. If you're a control player and you're playing against a combo deck, as an example, you will understand that there is going to be spells that you need to counter, and there's going to be a path that's going to take you to victory. And similarly, if you sit down against an aggro player, you're also going to need to have that level of understanding that, like, right, I might be trying to build this, beautiful and intricate combination of cards that's going to lead me to an inevitable victory. But if I have an aggressive player sitting on the other side of the table and they're just swinging these 2-1s at me, I might have to shift my focus a little bit, or I might have to maybe even play a creature for lesser value than I would like to, or use a burn spell or something that I would prefer not to, just to be able to keep myself alive so I can execute whatever combo I'm trying to pull off.
So that's why I'm going to direct this next pro towards May. I think it's important to have aggro because it generates game dynamics, mostly on the opponent side, because it makes them basically think on their feet. It puts them on their heels. Their problem-solving skills actually increase. I don't think the aggro player necessarily is directing problem-solving at a higher tier as the control player or the mid-range or the combo player now, because it's creating that dynamic, that tension in the game. Do you agree with that statement on a pro, May, for the idea of having aggro in your cube?
Yeah, I think generally that's a fair statement to make, but I tend to be in the boat that the degree of your aggro is what varies a lot, and it can be hard to assess within an environment how fast your aggro needs to be in order to be a relevant deck versus how fast it should be so other decks can exist. So I mentioned the fake cube earlier with intention because in that environment, my goal is to make it so that way mid-range is king. Mid-range is supposed to be like the better of the decks in that environment. Aggro exists here, but they have to really like claw, kick, and punch in order to get that last little bit of damage in. And it's by intention, because I'm trying to make it so that way the decks that are getting pressured by those aggro cards tend to rely on some late game combo or some late game stompy thing or insert miscellaneous pile of things here. But at the end of the day, I am sitting down with my aggro packages and asking, what decks is this trying to pressure? Why does this exist within my environment? And how can I make sure that it's healthy enough that not only it feels good to play, but it also feels good to play against?
I would say it's the hardest package to balance. I'm going to go ahead and establish that now. But I'm going to go to the cons now. And I'm going to say it's quickly outclassed. And sometimes because it's quickly outclassed on a board game state, it has the illusion or the appearance that it is weak, that it shouldn't exist. This card's not good enough. Comes up a lot because it's not taking cards in a vacuum based on like, and we'll talk about a few, but let's go back to Savannah Lions. It only cost you 1 planes. You could do 2 damage repeatedly if unadulterated. Would you all agree? Didn't cost you any investment. That was kind of the mana conversion that May did earlier in the episode here. But it's still, if it gets stopped quickly, it gets stonewalled by a Colonial Tusker.
Colonial Tusker.
Doesn't
yeah,
matter. Yeah. It gets stopped, then it has now an appearance that it shouldn't belong. It's weak. From the design perspective, or maybe from the players' interactions, the conversation will come up. Even though the purpose is there, the intent is there, it still can misrepresent itself. That's one problem with aggro.
Does
that make sense what I'm saying?
It does, but I'm going to provide a bit of a counterpoint, right? If you've played turn 1, and I've played my Savannah Lions, right? My turn 1 Savannah Lions. Turn 1 of my opponent, I don't know what they've done. Maybe they've done nothing. Maybe they've fetched a triome, or they've pondered, or whatever the case may be. If I've turned that creature sideways, and it's done that 2 damage for my 1 mana, it doesn't owe me anything anymore. And if they've got a 3/3 Colonial Tusker, yes, that is going to kill my 2/2, but it's already done its job. And that job could be, I could play another couple of those, right? Let's say I turn 2, play 2 more of those. I could swing all 3 into that Colonial Tusker. I've still only spent 1 mana on them. 1 may die. And in the great words, in the maybe one of the finest movies of all time, Shrek, that is a sacrifice I am willing to make. And I don't mind if that 1 mana 2 power creature is going down at that point. It doesn't owe me anything. It's already dealt 2 damage. Maybe it's dealt 4 damage at that point. But if I've put 3 of those onto the battlefield and they've done 2 damage and then 4 damage and then, oh no, maybe I've only done 4 more damage because one of them's dead, that's still a total of 10 damage. And that is a lot of pressure against any deck.
Okay. So the next one is another con that I feel is the linear gameplay that it can represent. And I'll go ahead and add this part. I support aggro of some form in all of my cubes.
Do you play them?
No, I don't, because I dislike it.
I just wanted to put that
I actively dislike it. Like, okay. I'll draft it when it comes around. If the draft is feeding me aggro, I will take aggro. Like Boros and Selesnya, some form of aggro or whatever. Even Orzhov, I can get a little spicier, but it's my least favorite way to play Magic. But I still will take it because the draft, no matter what, the draft is feeding me this. Everybody keeps passing me Savannah Lion type cards. I'm going to take Savannah Lion type cards. Just because it's the type of drafter I am, but I already know in my heart of hearts, I'm just not going to enjoy this experience as much.
I
It's
agree.
just not my type of play style.
I agree 100%. I avoid aggro. Just I'm going to turn creature sideways or I'm going to throw burn spells at your face. I avoid those kind of strategies like the plague. I don't find them enjoyable. I'm in the same boat. I don't find them enjoyable. I think Magic as an interactive and at times extremely complicated game, it's one of the reasons why I understand that aggro needs to exist, because you need to keep those other strategies in check, like your combo decks and your control decks, which is kind of unfortunate in some ways.
It is what it is, though. I mean, it provides a check.
It does, and and look, I'm kind of gatekeeping a little bit because I mean, look, I'll take our friend David, right? David is in our play group. David basically drafts aggro. Well, every time I play against him, it seems to be that he's got some kind of aggro deck. Not that there's not other, maybe it's like a little sub-theme dropped in there somewhere. But David tends to draft the most aggressive deck possible. And his win rate is very, very strong. So that does lead me to believe that, at least in your cubes or the cubes that we play when we hang out together, those aggro strategies are not just viable, but they're very strong.
May?
So, I'm definitely the odd duck here, because I actually like to draft aggro strategies. So I tend to play a lot of Is It an aggro decks, because I like to have a lot of these efficient low to the ground type cards and trying to look at what's the most efficient way that I can draft this in order to get my cards onto the board, and sometimes that just means unga bunga. But one nice thing that has come with Magic in its day and age of power creep is the fact that we are getting more interesting aggro cards. Before, aggro was boiled down to, yep, I have a pile of 2/2s with haste, or maybe like a 2/1 with haste, whatever, and that's it. That's the deck. I'm trying to beat you with the sack full of pennies, so to speak. But nowadays, you actually have cards like, Ragavan at like the absolute upper scale, or
May's jumping my show notes like the shark right now. You're Fonzie me so hard right now.
I think you could go even before that, right? Like haste, right? Look at some of those modern aggressive, like mono red or even cube mono red, where you got things like Monastery Swift Spear, right? Where you're not just being incentivized to play that creature because it has haste and because it's a 1-mana 1/1 that attacks the same turn that it comes down, but it's also got prowess. So now if you're burning them at the same time, so now you've got those keywords that are added on to those aggressive strategies to make it even more powerful.
I was just going to say, those types of things are important to keep in mind whenever you're building aggro packages or trying to look at a cube and figuring out what the aggro packages are, of how interesting is it, how inclined are people willing to draft into it, and whatnot. So while I can understand that some people just don't like drafting aggro, but I also think that it can be a fault of aggro's design changing in a lot of ways, because aggro used to be a lot more boring, and now we just have so many more interesting cards.
All right, I'm gonna counterpoint that again. I agree. I think those two examples that I provided, haste, prowess, those to me are kind of poster children for fair aggro keywords, right? The fact that you can turn your creature sideways the turn it comes down, and the fact that you can be incentivized to cast spells as well to furthermore pump your creatures, which is taking card out of your hand and you only start with 7, right? So there's a legitimacy to, I'm dumping my entire hand out, and I might not end the game with the cards that I've drawn. I might be top decking, but they really only add to that strategy. And here's the problem that I found, not just with, and this is not me trying to construct aggro decks, this is me trying to construct other decks, is we're now at the point that the cards that are incredibly powerful in other strategies, and I can even talk about a deck that I drafted literally yesterday, which was a green-white counters, I've got all the +1/+1 cards that I could possibly get, and any win condition that was using that +1/+1 counters. My job was not to necessarily turn them sideways, even though that did win me a couple of games. But those cards are also aggro cards. So I've got my little +1/+1 counters combo trying to win with, and I forget the name of the artifact, but if you've got 30 more counters, then you get to deal 10 damage to each opponent on your upkeep. I'm sure Anthony's going to keep me honest here in a second. It's in the Fem Cube, but
it's the artifact cube.
Oh, the artifact cube, I'm sorry. But that's a card that I am trying to leverage to win the game, right? So this is a combo-y kind of deck, even though I'm using creatures with +1/+1 counters on them. But that deck was incredibly cannibalized by other players, because anytime you just get to bang a bunch of +1/+1 counters on your creatures at the beginning of your upkeep or combat or whenever you do anything, that is also going to be a very strong, aggressive aggro strategy. So now we're not just faced with the choices that, you know, as a deck builder or as a cube curator out there, now you've got to take those considerations very, very seriously about what you are including in your other archetypes within your cube, because you just might be putting a little bit too many tools in the toolbox of those aggro strategies.
The card he's referencing is Lux Artillery.
Lux Artillery, thank you.
This card is nuts. Just look this one up. I'll just say Scryfall this card. I was told that this card wasn't really good enough, and I think for the second time now, I've proven this card is 100% good enough for the artifact.
I'm going to actually argue that I didn't use the triggered ability a single time. The 2 times that it was incredibly good for me was just sacking it before it had done anything else to, and I'm not going to start trying to think of card names, but it was to sack it to proliferate. So I literally just use it as a 4 mana, sack it, proliferate, end the game against our good friend Christian, and I managed to deal 20 points of damage in 1 turn.
Okay, so let's get back on the pure aggro conversation again. So another con that I have listed on here is card advantage issues and empty hand. And what I mean by that is using the Savannah Lions, using the Jackal Pups type of conversation. Typically, you empty your hand. We've got all our Jackal Pups, we got all our Savannah Lions on the field. We've emptied out 7 of those, representing 14 points of damage on the field. You're trying to get the damage in so much that you don't have that information hidden or withheld, so you're losing by virtue that card advantage, or the I guess the hat trick, the hidden information is what you're losing with playing aggro. Would you agree with that?
I would. And again, I'll go back to the classic modern deck of the, Taylor Swift Spear and Goblin Guide and all that. There was a time when, and I think maybe both of them are banned now, when Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time were both modern legal. I don't know if either of them are anymore, but modern burn decks that were typically mono red were literally splashing blue for no other purpose other than to play Treasure Cruise, which is obviously absolutely nuts to be able to just empty your hand and then for a couple of mana and delving away or, any creatures that died or any burn spells that you've cast, to be able to put 3 cards in your hand. And that's a game winning, that strategy is completely off the charts, how powerful that is. Because yes, you're right, card advantage, you're purposely disadvantaging yourself and just dumping your cards out as quickly as possible because you want to put your opponent on the back foot. And if you're top decking but your opponent has 1 life, that's normally a pretty good position to be in.
So ultimately the final con is it's on a clock. That clock is running out fast.
Absolutely.
You have to get it on the board, get the damage in, because the other decks are coming online. So if we want to just benchmark that as by turn 3, turn 4, opponent OP is representing now a threat of some kind that now stymies your original Jackal Pup type strategy. That's ultimately what I'm saying here. Sure. But let's kind of move into some discussion points here. This is important, and I want you to hear why this episode is happening. This is from 3 different friends, and we're going to talk about my vintage cube for a second. And there's 3 different opinions that have very much been declared. So the first one is from our good friend Sam, who says, you need more 1-drops in red. And he's exclamation marking this. Like literally, he's a firm believer in the single 2 1s for 1 type of drop here.
You've got Ragavan. What more do you need?
Okay, that leads me to Stu. This card is not playable in Vintage. I hear that a lot from our good friend Stu here, and that'd be like stuff like Kithian or Falconwraith Pitfighter, which we'll talk about here soon. And then our third one is Chris, who's the proponent, and I'm on this team, firmly believes you need this to challenge the other decks.
I would argue that you do not need to have Kithian or Falconwraith Pitfighter in your vintage cube in order to have an aggressive enough strategy to challenge the combo decks and the control decks.
Now I think, he's conflating the idea of speed versus aggression versus aggro package in my mind. That's what I'm hearing. May, you're now we're now in counseling. Would you like to talk to us about your feelings on what was just said?
Since apparently I'm the couple's counselor
Judge,
now,
Judge. Yeah, Your Honor, I want this Beanie Baby.
So, I think the issue is that you're trying to see this as each of these things cannot be coincidentally correct, and it's just a matter of perspective. I think that that's the main limiting factor for you both. And my reasoning for saying this is that I agree. I don't think that Falcon Wraith Pit Fighter is vintage playable. Having a 2-1 that you can sacrifice to get some cards is so whatever for aggro. But that's not to say that having a 2-1 that has an interesting line of subtext that's relevant for aggro isn't important for the environment.
I agree. So that's kind of an evaluation point too. These 2-1s for ones, they're dying off in droves, and they're getting replaced with more modern cards. Now use our semi-modern flagship Goblin Guide. We're going to get rid of Jackal Pup. We're going to get rid of Savannah Lions.
Right.
Because those died. They died because now they have more flavor text, also more keywords, more everything on them now. The cards are they're more tooled. Kind of like Ragavan that was mentioned early on. So Goblin Guide, for those that aren't familiar, and I don't know how you wouldn't be, you're living underneath a rock, but this is a great card. But for one mountain, you get a creature, Goblin Scout, haste. Whenever Goblin Guide attacks, defending player reveals the top card of their library. If it's a land card, that player puts it into their hand for a 2/2. And then it has an amazing flavor text. I've been all over this world. I even remember some of those places. But we don't get flavor text like this anymore.
But
right. My point is like, this is now the pressure point that's also dying. This one's slowly dying off from cubes.
I wonder if the Surveil lands have been some kind of contributing factor to the downfall of things like Goblin Guide. Because look, it's a 1-mana 2/2 with haste. Yes, it has an advantage for your opponent, but if it's just a land, like, yeah, whatever. But I think the Surveil lands have kind of been the nail in the coffin for stuff like that. Because if I've got a fetch land out and you reveal my card and it's a land and I don't want it, then I'll just Surveil it away. If it's a land and I do want it, then I'll just go fetch whatever other mana that it's not going to give me if that's what my deck needs. Or, you know, there's a whole bunch of, you know, that information is not just for you, right? It's for your opponent, it's for you as well. So, and it's just a 2/2 for 1, and it 2/2 for 1 mana, and yeah, it attacks, but so what?
Yep, it puts pressure on people that are trying to establish. Let's go to our next one. What's happening is the words are getting added to it. The next one I have is Usher the Fallen. I'm not going to totally read this card, but it has Boast, and essentially you can create a 1/1 white human warrior token after you've attacked. Right. And it's a 2/1. And so that card now establishes itself as pretty predominant. Like, I love this card. It's great. And then we go into the conversation that Stu and I've had is about Kythian. And Kythian is also a 1-drop that is a 2/1 that has the potential to become a Planeswalker.
It has the potential to become a Planeswalker.
Which kind of gives it's kind of like that edge conversation we had we talked about our orbits of power, where it was kind of the cancel conversation versus dissolve conversation versus counterspell versus mana drain.
Yeah.
That's kind of what's happening to these aggro packages.
Correct.
They're kind of just falling off. And if you're running Savannah Lions and Jackal Pup, I want to play this cube. Like, we're not here to poo-poo on these ideas. I think they're fantastic cards. It's just like in the world of Magic, when you're trying to keep up with all the tech, the vanilla ones or the French vanilla ones kind of get shoved to the back over time.
We're also being a little fixated, I think, on creatures that enter with 2 power for only 1 mana.
Well, it's important because I think that is the establishing, like, the waypoint. And what I'm trying to write here as the beginning starting point for aggro.
Yes, you are, but we're also doing this in the context of a vintage cube.
I'm going back and forth because not all these are exclusive. Like Falcon Wrath Pit Fighter is in my horror cube. It's also in my Fem cube. It plays the role in both of those, but it gets different attributes because, like, Falcon Wrath Pit Fighter in the horror cube now gets to see the lords that make this larger.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
So this is not just your regular 2/1 if you have a strategy that incentivizes you, as an example, to draft vampires. I'm not going to...
Or Delirium. It changes the attributes of this card.
Absolutely. And look, discarding a card is pretty strong in a lot of cubes, right?
So
but
it's
also
diminishing
1 mana,
returns, but it has potential.
and then 2 mana. Yeah.
Yeah. And now we go into what's kind of set the new modern era, and May jump to this one. You were talking about Ragavan.
So, Ragavan is a 1-drop 2/1 legendary creature monkey pirate Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, create a treasure token and exile the top card of that player's library, and until the end of the turn, you may cast that card. You can also dash it for 1 and a red, which just means that you can put it into play, it has haste, and then at the end of the turn, it returns back to your hand. So, Ragavan is, I would say, the upper end of what aggro cards should be doing. Like, I would dare to say that this even shows up in decks that aren't aggro just because of the things that it's doing is predominant enough. If it connects, you get a treasure token. If it connects, you get a steal card potentially. It doesn't matter if you actually get to steal a card because you still have a 2/1 that just made you a treasure, right? And that one treasure now just turned your turn 2 into 3 available mana, but only for that turn, right? And later you can just keep, if you end up drawing this card, then you can dash it into play to immediately get that value. It does 2 things that are very important for modern day aggro decks to function. And it gives you some sort of card value, like card value return, whatever we want to call it, and a way to lean into another strategy. The fact that it gives you that additional mana is huge. The fact that it lets you steal a card is huge.
Yeah, and the fact that it does
both is insane.
Yeah, so it kind of leads. So I think that one's like the perfect like amalgamation of a lot of strategies.
Even just playing Magic.
That was one of my questions: is Ragavan aggro?
An aggro card?
And I don't think it exclusively is. It's a lot of different things, and so
can be. But
I would argue that it's pretty aggro. Like, it's not a control card necessarily. I wouldn't call it.
But I would run it in a control show.
You would,
but
would you run it? Why would you run it? Would you run it just because you want the card advantage? Because
I want
you
the
want
card
the mana
acceleration. I want the top of
acceleration?
their library, and I want the treasure.
Absolutely, 100%.
That's control.
But that is. But you could also argue that's sort of an aggro control way of playing.
It is.
And the aggro is coming from the Ragavan.
Now we're seeing it. All right, cool. So let's kind of go up. We've moved off the 2/1 for 1. Let's move up a little bit. And so I'm going to encourage listeners to go to the show notes or Scryfall, because I'm going to list these cards off for the essence of time. So we've got modern cards like Slick Shot Show Off, or we have Emberheart Challenger, or we have Lelia the Blade Forge, or Broadside Bombardiers. Now I've jumped from the level 2s for mana cost to level 3s. All of these have one very common keyword. Does haste equal aggro?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so we can have a 5-drop that has haste and that's still aggressive and still falls into an aggro?
It could be. What if your cube's the 5-mana cube?
So haste is a very good equalizer for this idea.
Haste is one of the 2 things that matters here. You either have something that's hasty. Sorry, one of the 3 things that matter. Something that's hasty, something that has a strong ETB, or something that taxes your opponent life. So think Eidolon of Revels, right? Where, hey, every time that you cast something that's within these conditions types cards, you take additional damage. It doesn't matter if it doesn't have haste, because at that point, I'm dealing damage without having to attack, which also gives me assurance for later in the game as well. Right? All 3 of those things are important for an aggro card to do. If an aggro card only is just an efficient body, then it's not enough anymore. At least in terms of like higher power environments. In lower power environments, you could probably have a couple cards that do like 1 or 2 of those things. Maybe you could get away with having some French vanillas in there, right? But at the end of the day, one of those 3 things is what makes an aggro deck an aggro deck.
So you made a good point. So the context, and everybody loves context matters because nobody loves that statement, but it's the most true statement you can make. So in a Powered Vintage Cube, Lelia is starting to kind of fall off a little bit. Still fantastic card, but those 3 drops are highly contested. Modern cards just keep doing the same thing that the 2/1 for 1 were doing.
Oh, the game is getting faster
churning.
as well.
It's churning.
Yeah.
It's always churning.
Yeah.
But then take Lelia and then put it in my Fem Cube. I won't, because I think it's way too strong in there. Like, it's too pushed. It get that ability to exile and get larger and larger and larger. We're going to kind of talk about that a little bit, but there's some point where there's a little line where your aggro has tilted too far. And I know this from the first iteration of the Fem. Very first day, we talked about this before. I came out, had all my mixtapes made up, introducing everybody to the Fem Cube. I was so excited to unveil it. We were at a good buddy Nathan's house, drinks flowing, music going, and then aggro just mop the floor with every player. Nothing I could do. And it wasn't my intent. It just so happens that most of the art-driven aesthetics of the cube just happened to fall into an aggro stance, like the lion's share of this idea. And Lelia was one of the cards that actually I premiered. And I remember it was just a beatdown. There's nothing anybody could do about it because he couldn't establish a mid-range or a control deck. So I had to balance that because it kind of goes to that, I guess, the balancing of the power between those three major components. Wed combo in is the unchecked one to a degree, but you've got your paper, rock, scissors, whether people believe that or not. And you always kind of have to balance that power. Aggro can be too predominant. You can have too many that was back to my pushback on Sam. You got to have more of those one drops reds that hit really fast. I understand his logic in the vintage cube to contest all these other powerful strategies. But I think there's a point where it starts becoming, you start putting too many linear cards in there, like the Falcon Wrath we've talked about over and over again. You start getting too much of that, then you're taking card slots, equity, away from these other strategies that people want to play.
Yeah, and then what do you want? Do you want it to become the aggro cube because you've got way too many mana red creatures in there?
Yeah,
like,
right.
No.
It's hard to balance. There's no formulaic way that I could just address that.
Sure.
But I thought it was worth pointing that out. Let's kind of move over to something else. The Artifact Cube. And this is prepped for CubeCon 2024. And May, I want your opinion on this one. You actually mentioned this. You're the reason why I did this. Because I didn't have an established aggressive package. Not really. The whole cube is it's even themed as machine-like in terms, what do they call it? A mechanical cube in so many words. And by that happening with all those metalworkers and things we've talked about and whatever, the simulacrum synthesizer, whatever I may be running, which I'm not now, but any of these machine type components, I became so focused as a curator on that idea of machina that I stopped thinking about people needing to contest it. Right? So I added, and I'm thanking May for this, I added Signal Pest.
I suppose I would ask the question, why are they being contested?
Because they're too... that's
Is
the
it
question.
because they're just individually too strong? Is it because they play well into other strategies? Is it the fact that they're just colorless and sometimes just being able to, use a slot in your deck for a creature that's a must answer? Like Lelia's a great example of a creature. If you have the ability to just splash a red card, or maybe even your strategy involves red and you're playing it anyway, a card like Lelia, right? Yeah, she might have fallen down the ranks quite significantly when it comes to Vintage Cube, but in certainly when you look at your Artifact Cube or your Fem Cube or any cube where you can kind of splash a card like that, now suddenly you've got this card that's like a crazy engine and it's super splashable. And now it's like I can just put this card out and I can just focus on my other strategy, my main strategy, and put something in that's just going to maybe throw my opponent off their game a little bit.
This is based on a lot of conversations I've heard from other curators and their opinions of aggro, and based on primarily on the cons that I provided at the beginning of the episode. May, in your opinion, do you hear oftentimes a sentiment that aggro is dead or people don't want it anymore? Even based on some of the stuff that Stu just said. Is the death of aggro coming?
I don't think that there's ever going to be truly a death to aggro. I think that as the game gets more powerful, that we are going to reach an inevitability that aggro is going to have to take on attributes of combo decks, mid-range decks, whatever, on addition of being aggro packages. And I think that for better and for worse, it can be an obstacle for designing aggro in Cube, because when we have an aggro card that does a lot of things like Ragavan, at what point does it stop being an aggro card, At what point is it just good in an aggro deck, but also good in a mid-range deck, right? And the lines will become more blurred as time goes on, but I don't think that it's the death of aggro, because aggro is fundamentally a style of deck building. It is fundamentally a way to build your deck in as lean, as efficiently as possible to either turn sideways or do a certain lineup of cards to make sure that your opponent is dead by a certain turn, right?
So going back to the Artifact Cube, and kind of the problem that I noticed from CubeCon #1 where it was featured, it was two decks that predominated. It was the Selesnya Control Spectrum, which was all the disenchants. We know that's real, because it was really weird to say that out loud.
I'm laughing because of the truth of the statement.
Because it's real. And then we had the equipment strategies that was deemed aggro. And I had a problem with that And it was because I had designed it that way. And it wasn't that the statement was wrong. It's just not what I wanted to happen. So I took a step back. So now we're going to the third iteration of KubeCon, right? And here's what I've done in order to create, like, I guess to play to the idea of the pressure points. I said signal pest. For one colorless, you get a 0/1 artifact creature pest. Battle cry, and that's whenever it attacks, it creates a one. It basically makes like a +1 anthem on aggro for all the other stuff. Mm-hmm. And then signal pest can't be blocked except by creatures with flying or reach. Okay, so I added that just the other day because it's a pressure point. I wanted the kind of breakthrough decks to start pressuring those machine decks, those technical decks, because it needs to happen. And then I've got Yotian Frontliner. It basically does a +1/+1 to a target creature until end turn. It has Unearth. And then I have Rabbit Battery, which is a pretty good aggro card. Also adding to this suite, I've got Beaumont Courier, which is another haste creature that kind of gives you that card advantage oftentimes that aggro is lacking. I know this to be true. I've got Reinforced Ronin. And then here's a new card I want to talk about that's kind of the new idea of, I'm going to ask this spec, does haste equal aggro? It's Lava Spur Boots. For one colorless, you get an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+0 and has haste and ward 1, equip 1. Does that make any creature that you drop into an aggro creature at that point? That's my question for the two of you.
I mean, it gives a creature haste. It buffs it. I think the ward 1 is just kind of a little gravy on there. It's relatively inexpensive to cast and to equip. So, yes, it is definitely a card that you can include in an aggressive strategy. Yes.
Okay.
I would put it into the same category as Bone Splitter or Short Sword. I think that the keyword that it provides, it might be redundant for some aggro decks, depending on how many caster creatures currently exist, but the fact that it already gives the +1 and ward are two relevant things for getting pressure on, which is what you're wanting to do as an aggro deck. So, I would think that this is a pretty reasonable aggressive card.
Okay. So that's kind of the closure of the artifact cube. I think I've kind of solved that problem. I wanted something that challenged these machine decks, the technical decks, the stuff that you were doing that we were talking about. You're calling it an aggro. It was an aggro strategy, but you're doing counters and proliferation, which is a different type of strategy in my mind.
Yes.
You're very mid-range.
I'm not spending each turn trying to reduce my opponent's life total. That was not the purpose of my deck. Like each turn, I'm not trying to be as aggressive as possible towards my opponent. I'm trying to develop a game plan each turn. That is my strategy rather than turn the creature sideways or burn my opponents out. And just for the record, I got absolutely annihilated by aggro.
And by me when I cheated. And so May...
It's easy to win when you cheat. More at 10.
So, a question that got mentioned earlier by Stu was, why do they need to be pressured? And in the case of your artifact cube, it's important to keep your artifact cube honest. Because there are so many colorless cards that can just be thrown into so many different decks that it's very, very easy to end up with a pile of just good stuff. It is very easy to end up with a pile of, yep, this is just a pile of the best cards in the pack, and I'm just going to slam them down until I win, right? Yes, you can get into the more technical decks. You can go into the more, I will call them Johnny decks, right? But at the end of the day, aggro keeps those decks humble. Because it doesn't matter how many good stuff that you collect through your packs, no matter how many pieces to your efficient engine that you get together, because you will still have to worry about the aggro matchup.
And I'm going to say that the aggro package benefits the opponent's play capability. They learn from it, right? They have to adapt. They have to overcome. It's a clock that's put on them. Maybe they had a strategy that was very clean to them in their mind, but it forces them now to make choice decisions on how they want to deal with it. So I kind of put it like it just makes better players by one player forcing you now to, I guess, come off the rails a little bit, think outside the box. There's a benefit from that dynamic in my mind to having a pressure deck exist. It may not feel that way when the 2 1s-for-1s are coming at you, but it's forcing you, the control player, now to reutilize your cards outside of that original, like, strategic idea, the overarching idea that you had prior.
I think this is where the balance needs to be so critical in the construction of the cube, because yes, you're absolutely right. You are looking for aggro to keep other decks honest, right? But in my experience, I can only speak for that, I have generally lost predominantly against aggro decks when I have tried to be cute with my drafting, which I try to do every time. I'm always looking for the synergy. I'm always trying to draft something that has, not necessarily a combo. I don't very often draft control. I used to very hard force control a lot of the time. I don't so much anymore. I'm typically looking for synergy. And I will say that the majority of the times where I get my rear end handed to me handily is when I am going up against the deck that someone has built where their purpose is to turn their creature sideways and kick the bejesus out of me.
So your strategy is typically, like, you're the general on the horseback a lot of times. You're sitting back, you're overarching, you're seeing the battlefield.
I'm at least trying to... And not to say that I'm always testing when I'm drafting, because, yes, I like to win, right? People, when they sit down, they don't want to sit down and think, okay, well, I've drafted this deck to lose, but at least I'm going to do something fun, right? This isn't Commander. But at the very least, I want my deck to synergize. I want the cards to have a purpose within a strategy, right? And more often than not, like I say, when I lose, I'm losing because someone has just turned creature sideways. I can go back to yesterday where that exact same thing happened. I can go back to the last time I played Magic where I drafted what I thought was a really, really fun deck. Lots of synergy in there. I lost one match and it was to our good friend Avram, and he literally just built that turn creature sideways deck, and he just wiped the floor with me in the first 4 or 5 turns. And the other deck played against, where it did seem that they were looking to build some synergy into their decks, it was a lot more back and forth and more interactive. And even if the interaction wasn't constant every turn, there was some kind of process where both of us were trying to do something with the cards that we drafted rather than just turn them sideways or end the game.
So I have to ask, Stu, do you feel like that in those environments where you got run over by aggro, were there cards that you could have drafted that you maybe didn't incentivize fully that could have answered those strategies a little better?
There was definitely there was one time where I knew that I was making maybe the most difficult choice, but I did it because it was the fun choice. And it was between, it's the 1 green mana enchantment, gives you an extra +1/+1 counter, and I'm absolutely blanking on the name. Anthony?
Don't know right now. Are you referring to
Hardened Scales? Thank you, May. Thank you, May. I know I can rely on you. So it was a choice between Hardened Scales and Wrath of God. And I knew that I needed a Wrath effect. I was praying that either another Wrath effect or that card would come round, because I knew that if I ran into a hyper-aggressive strategy that I was going to be in trouble.
Yes,
and that's exactly what happened. I had ways. +1/+1 counters are a great way that even if I wipe the board and I've got my own relatively strong board presence, the fact that I have like Hardened Scales and other effects on the battlefield that are going to synergize with my strategy, I know that I only need 1 or 2 cards to establish another good board presence. Whereas with an aggressive strategy, again, if you're playing those undercosted creatures, like even a 2/1, if I play a 1/1 or a 1/2, even if it's for 2 mana, but it's getting +1/+1 counters and then another +1/+1 counter, I'm going to get value out of that. So, and not to mention, and I'll go all the way back to what I was talking about earlier with how you can cannibalize your other strategies with those aggro cards. The game that I played against our good friend David yesterday, he had, as well as actually our friend Grant, both of them had cards that were beautifully synergistically with my deck, but they were such bonkers aggro cards, because you've got a +1/+1 counter archetype in that artifact cube, and do you know what +1/+1 is really strong for? Turning creatures sideways, making them bigger, and putting pressure on your opponent's life total. You have to make that choice now. Do you take those creatures out, right? Or those strategies that are very, very strong in aggro, and maybe put more supportive cards? Like, I'm not saying you should put Doubling Season in there as an example. Hint, Anthony, you should totally put Doubling Season in there. But those kind of cards are just so powerful on both sides of the coin that there was such a high contest for that strategy that I didn't get to play Grant, but David
Well,
mocked me.
until I messed up, I blundered. I totally misplayed a card, and I conceded at that point because I had air quotes cheated inadvertently. I didn't mean to, but Manifest Dread, I played it wrong.
You did.
But at that point, before I made the mistake, I was already pressure pointing Stu pretty hard because I'm going to declare him as a mid-range deck. He's putting counters on things.
It's a combo deck.
Yeah.
I would say it's a combo
Whereas
deck.
I am literally almost just Rakdos, just turning sideways.
It's a lot easier to say that you're pressuring me when you've cheated and took out my Steel Overseer.
That did happen.
Let's be honest,
We are not gonna
because
let it go
if
this
that
episode.
exists, the next
Couples
turn,
counseling goes back online.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that,
So
but sure.
let's switch over to Sandwich's Peasant Cube. We may have been drinking. New words. But Sandwich's Peasant Cube, also, he felt, and this is where I kind of did the whole signal pest idea, because also Sandwich felt the same thing, that he's also featured at CubeCon 2024 with his Sandwich's Peasant Cube. And he was seeing that mid-range decks were just building up too fast, right? Peasant Cubes are very creature-centric, and a lot of stuff was stonewalling the idea of the air quotes. He doesn't run at Savannah Lions, whatnot, right? So he has now reestablished that by putting cards in like Goblin Bushwhacker or Bolt Hound, and these will all be in the show notes, but for the essence of time, these type cards, in order to create more diversity in those pressure points, so that those creature heavy type of cubes are still challenged. Doesn't even have to be just combo. It just has to be anything that'll stonewall that idea of those aggressive cards coming in and shutting it down. It could be your basically your turn 4 cycle of cards.
Right.
You agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's kind of what he's been doing too. So we've kind of taken notes from one another because he was seeing a similar problem in his Peasant Cube where I'm seeing it in my Artifact Cube. Let's tie that off. Let's go to the next one. Let's go to the FIM. I've got a new edition. And this was kind of going back to the original story I told you in the way back, and this wasn't so way back. The FIM Cube had a problem with aggro being overly dominant. And I've been hesitant as a result to add aggro pieces back into the FIM Cube, so much so that I felt like Blink and these mid-range strategies were kind of taken over, these control strategies. So I wanted to add a key piece of pressure point. There's a new card that I wanted to talk about with May. It's the Reckless Pyro Surfer. For 1 colorless and 1 red, you get a 2/2. Creature, Human Scout, Haste, Landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, Reckless Pyro Surfer gains Battle Cry until the end of the turn.
That's a good card.
It's a good
I
card.
like that card.
I am absolutely in love with this card. Love with it. For one very simple reason. It is an aggro card that aggro players can rely upon to squeeze damage through, that doesn't cannibalize and isn't parasitic in any other strategy. Certainly in that cube. There's no, I don't know if I want to, can I say this? There's no landfall specific strategy in the Fem Cube, right?
No.
So no one cares about landfall other than the fact that the aggro player wants
it's not
to
contested.
be. It's not contested. It has haste. It's aggressive. I think this card is perfection.
And this was a recommendation from Sandwich.
So, know the thing that I love the most about this card? It turns the one thing that aggro players despise into damage.
Lands.
Drawing lands.
I
Top
need
decking
I
lands.
need one and then more cards. I need more gas in order to put pressure on this game. Oh shoot, I just drew another land. This just turns your lands into damage, and that is beautiful.
And so I actually wasn't going to add this card until I put all the landscapes in there. So now I have fetches plus landscapes. This suddenly becomes pretty powerful.
Pretty nice to just, there's my fetch. Battle cry. Next turn. Crack my fetch. Battle cry again.
Yeah.
Juicy.
So I think it's a fun addition, also featured at CubeCon 2024, and I just want to share that with the audience, get your thoughts on that. So I'm going to go back to the original question that I asked in the beginning of the episode. May, so what do we mean when we say an aggro deck?
So I think what we mean when we were saying what an aggro deck is that it is a deck that is very efficient, that is trying to get your opponent's life points to 0 as quickly as possible with the least amount of resources spent as possible. I'm sure that there's more eloquent things that I can add, but I think that
summarizes it
the
nicely.
gist of it.
How about yourself, Stu?
Yeah, I would agree 100%. An efficient deck that, regardless of my own life total, which I don't care about, regardless of how many cards I've got in my hand or what my opponent is doing, which I care nothing about either, all I am trying to do is expend my resources as efficiently as possible to win the game as quickly as I can and keep the pressure up.
And so I have a bias question that I'll reflect upon myself here. Why is aggro so important to a cube?
It's not. It should leave.
I disagree strongly.
I'm kidding. You need your aggro.
It's there for game dynamics that must exist. I do not feel, and Stu and I expressed this early in the episode, I do not like to draft aggro. I do not find it fun. I don't find it interesting. It's just not my style of gameplay.
I
Outside of Luris, those type of things.
Luris is not necessarily an aggro.
It creeps into it, but you see where I'm at.
Yeah.
But pressure points. But I don't want to play this type of game. But I understand why this game must exist, because when, let's just say, we go back to David. David loves this. David's coming at me with these Savannah Lions, these Jackal Pups. Regardless of how I feel about that deck, I now have to think outside of my normal strategy. I have to reacquisition, get my reticles back on different targets. That's my point. I think it makes me a better player.
Yeah, and I think it's, I will again go back to, I think it's very complicated nowadays with how, certainly I'll look at your cubes and the construction of your cubes as a great reference point, that there needs to be so much care with how you construct other archetypes within a cube and whether or not you are cannibalizing archetypes and especially key pieces of other archetypes that can also be very, very strong complementary pieces to an aggro strategy that will just be big pieces for a synergistic strategy. Because that was, again, I will say that was I don't want to say it was a problem. I felt like I drafted a good deck. I did not get a picture of it. Otherwise, I should have put it up on our Deck Bows channel. Shout out to the Discord. But I definitely noticed when I was looking at those aggro decks that they were taking those pieces because they were very, very strong aggro cards. And just be so careful when you're putting cards like that in there, or if you're looking at your aggro package and looking at pieces that can complement it, but if those complementary pieces or whatever those pieces are for your aggro package, if they are strong pieces for other archetypes within the cube, that understand that the aggro players are going to take them. And they're, because as an aggro player, yes, you want to take all those efficient creatures, right? But you want the strong cards, the bombs first, right? So a card that might not necessarily be considered an aggro card, like out of the box, if you will, but a card that's pumping all of your other creatures with +1/+1 counters, like that is a premium aggro card. Like it's a really premium top end card, and why it might be an incredible synergy card for like your +1/+1 counter deck. Be careful not to incentivize too heavily your aggro players to take pieces that are going to be important for those other strategies.
So let's do a little bit of closing notes here. So you can find myself and May at CubeCon 2024, where we're going to have featured cubes. May has the Fae Cube featured. Mm-hmm. And then Sandwich is going to have his Peasant Cube featured, which was featured last year, as well as May's Fae Cube. Nice. Exciting. And people loved it. So I encourage you to go draft that environment as well that we talked about. And then I'm going to have UberBear's Artifact Cube, the Fem Cube, and the Monopoly, all from October the 17th to the 20th. You can find us there. It's going to be really great. Tickets are still available. I'll throw a link for the convention up onto the show notes where you can find this and come join us. It's going to be a great time. Come try this cubes. Come up to May and I and say, hey, I think this is your aggro package.
I'm sad I'm going to miss it this year. Unfortunately, other commitments have pulled me away from CubeCon 2024, but Anthony and May are going to be there to represent UberCube and the Cube community, just like all.
Are you going to go see Oasis, the reunion?
I'm not. No. That
was the only thing that would give you an excuse.
That would be less fun than what I'm doing, which could be chewing my toenails. I'd rather be doing that.
All right, let's. Anyway, this is fun. So, what is aggro? Don't hurt me.
Don't hurt me.
No more.
No more.
Dun. All right, take the socials.
To all of our beloved Patreons, Chris Fitzgerald, Timber Dragon, Brian Christensen, Keaton Schultz, Lord Justice, Chris Singer, Nick LaPointe, Preston, and Sam McKenna. Thank you to all of you for your ongoing support, helping us keep the lights on. Really does help the show out. And I think that that mic stand is on back order, so maybe next week. I don't know. As always, if you have enjoyed this episode, we would encourage you go back and listen to the rest of our episodes. We promise you they're just as fun as this one. And give us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform. Really goes a long way to getting us out there to the Cube community and the greater Magic community as well. You can also support the show. Go and use our ultasleeves.com/UberCube affiliate link. Get 5% off your purchase, as well as inkedgaming.com/UberCube. Go and check them out for cool playmats, dice bags, mouse pads, custom and large volume products available for your cube or otherwise Magic experience. You can reach us at Twitter. Go check out what we got going on, UberCubeMTGPod. You can also reach us via email. If you've got a longer question about Cube or about the podcast or anything Cube related, you can reach us at UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com. As always, come check out the Discord, all kinds of cool community feedback, discussion, decks. Want to see those decks in that Deck Boast channel. And again, if you want to support the show, patreon.com/UberCube. Big thanks to all of our patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, we're going to do Happy
Cubing.
Cubing.
What is aggro?
No more.